Hi, everybody. Okay, I'm here with Avner Dorman, my friend and incredible composer. And the reason we're here is because when Avner came to Fredonia, we were playing the double concerto. He spoke to the students about interpretation and the combination, the relationship between composer and performer. And I wished I had a camera on him to capture what he was saying. Like, how wonderful would it have been to have a YouTube with Brahms and Rachmaninoff talking about their collaboration. So this is what this is. So welcome, Avner. Thank you for joining me. Um,
Great seeing you, always.
yeah.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you already like sort of have a theory, like what's the best perfect combination of composer performer relationship? Like how would you define that relationship for you?
For me, yeah, I think I know what works for me. I think it's important for me that a performer sort of embodies things that are almost contradictory. On the
Okay.
one hand, like tries to understand everything that I'm trying to do and kind of goes with it. And but on the other hand, has their own idea about the music, their own ideas about the music, and adds their own interpretation, their own sort of musicality, their own expression, and also when needed, help me with the technical aspects of the music. So it's kind of it maybe it's a little bit contradictory, sounds a little bit contradictory, but a performer that like wants to understand what I'm trying to say, really gets into it, and then brings themselves to the table. I think if either side is missing, that can be difficult to navigate.
So if somebody's not doing anything with the score versus somebody doing too much with the score, do you feel like you know where that line is, or is it something that really depends on the performer?
Yeah, I don't know that there is too much. I think if a good performer, a good interpreter, a good musician, whatever they do with the music contributes to the music. Like in a world premiere, I usually like to have the music presented somewhat closer to the way I wrote it. But I do think that a good piece of music allows for interpretation. So I think over time, like I think in the premiere, it's almost like kind of a personal thing that I'm like, well, I want to hear it the way I thought that it needs to sound, at least to a certain degree. Like I want to hear the notes, I want to hear the rhythms, I want the tempo to be similar to what I wrote. Although many times my tempo ends up not being the ideal tempo for the piece. Or
Wait, that's a really important point. You're saying like what you imagined should be is actually not the truth for the piece, and you can only discover that via the performance, or
I think it's sometimes not I don't know if it's not the truth for the piece, but it might not be the ideal tempo for the piece. So because of the
no, I
physics,
mean, we need to stop here because if we could go back to Beethoven and tell him or Schumann about the crazy metronome marking, is like actually her Beethoven, it actually doesn't quite work in that tempo. Do you think he would be accepting of it, or he said like, no, I really meant, those crazy, 144 und schneller for the piece?
again, I don't know that it's about what he meant or didn't mean. Like I also mean my tempos. Like I do mean them and I do hear the piece like that. And I usually will stay with the piece in my mind like that. But I do think that I think Beethoven is a great example. Like in reality, the last movement of the Eighth Symphony does not work at the tempo that Beethoven wrote.
Mhm.
Because in reality, it doesn't. I've really tried. I've conducted it and I've tried. I was like, I'm gonna go with his tempo, and it's just like it's fun to perform, but like too much of the music is lost because of elements of the physicality of the instruments, the acoustics of even just the acoustics of the hall you're performing in.
Right.
Like I don't even know that there's one tempo for a piece, right? If you're playing again Beethoven 8, if you're playing it with a small orchestra in a small hall, maybe his tempo is more reasonable than if you're playing with a large orchestra in a very reverberating hall. So like there's a lot of things that go into it, and I think again, if the performer, the interpreter comes to it from a point of view of understanding what the composer wanted to say, and saying it in the most effective, expressive, meaningful way, then the interpretation enhances the music.
I'm glad you opened that door, because you say what the composer meant. That's such an incredible, ideological question. What is it? Is it the notes themselves? Is there an emotional meaning behind the notes? Is it the relationship between the different sections? Like, how would you describe meaning in music in your compositions?
I think it's all of these things and perhaps more. So yes, there is an emotional undercurrent to a certain musical idea. And sometimes I'm not even sure that I know all of the emotional possibilities of a section of music. This is what I'm saying, that I think that good music, for it to survive, like music that is written down, for it to survive over time, it has to be flexible enough. It has to have enough possibilities to allow for someone to play it like Glenn Gould and like Rubinstein. Like, that's really great music, right? The better the music, the more it allows a variety of interpretations, a variety of...
You're saying that by definition, the multiplicity of possibilities within a piece is really what makes it great and what makes it exciting for us. I mean, obviously as performers to approach it, but I guess, what the other point you're saying is that there's a core to that, to the piece. There's a core of meaning that as performers we need to access. And the question is, and I think this is really important point, is A, how do we know we're right? And B, is there right and wrong?
So I think the core for me, I'm more of a form structure.
I never knew that.
I think the grammar of the music has a core. So like, I think if you do something that contradicts the grammar of the music, that's when the music is not going to cooperate. Like if you misunderstand the tonality of a piece, if you misunderstand the phrase structure, if you contradict the phrase structure in a way that doesn't work, then it doesn't matter what you feel or what the composer felt or whatnot. It's just not going to sound right.
Even with that, I know we're going to go off on tangents today, like nobody's business, but Pogorelic taking the Rachmaninoff second piano concerto, at a crazy slow tempo, but embedding it with so much conviction and emotion that, again, we're not going to say if it's bad or good, but that's a very radical take. Or even Gould's performance of the Brahms concerto is historically slow. Now when you listen to it, you go, it's actually not that slow.
So again, I think for me as a composer, from the composer's point of view, I can say that when interpreters go against the music, that's when there's a problem. Like, either by not trying to understand it, or not trying to understand where the phrase structure is, for example. I don't know that Glenn Gould didn't understand the phrase structure in the Brahms concertos. He just did something very different interpretation-wise with the same phrase structure. Now, I've heard pianists or violinists or whatever play music and kind of miss the point of how the grammar works, how the harmony works, how the structure, what the balance is. Like, there are things that are more tangible than like an emotional undercurrent. And I agree that when you're talking about meaning in the sense of emotional undercurrent or expression, this is what I'm saying, like, a good interpreter can bring something that I might not even notice is possible with a piece of music. And I think that's great. I think that's wonderful. You hear it. I've been listening to songs and their covers recently. Popular songs and their covers. And sometimes you don't even know that a song is a cover.
Right.
You listen to the original, and it's sometimes very similar. Sometimes it's really, really, really different. And sometimes there's a song that seems fairly mundane, and a good cover uncovers something, like you talk about the truth, like a truth that is in that song that nobody noticed before.
I keep thinking of Sinead O'Connor and Nothing Compares to You, which was actually a Prince
Yes, there you go. And it wasn't a
I
song.
didn't even know it was a Prince song until recently.
Yeah, and of his songs, that was not one that was particularly successful originally.
Mm.
It was not. But he wrote it. But there was a potential in that song. That's a great example. There was a potential in that song. We were listening to the song "Respect," a classic Motown song, originally sung by a man.
Huh.
And you hear a man singing it, it's awful. He's like a total jerk. But then when a woman sings it, it's awesome. And they added the background singers, and it's just an amazing, one of the great songs of all times. And so, yes, I think that even music that is not originally written, in our field, all you get are notes. That you don't even get like a performance. But here you get a performance of the person that wrote the song, and someone else takes it and makes something better out of it. And I think that's, for me, if you ask me again, as a composer, what is an ideal performer for me is someone who can understand my music to the degree that they can uncover something that I may not have noticed about it. And I think that's where music and like the Sinead O'Connor, that's the Prince song. That's the great thing about that song. It had more in it than you could hear in Prince's original recording, which he, by the way, sang and played all the instruments, like on every song that he ever recorded. So he did everything, and it's still not nearly as good as the version that she recorded. And you find it all the time happening in popular music. And so why not in our field? It's even more extreme. I don't give you anything. I give you some paper. I send you a PDF, and do something with it. Right. So I can't be too crazy about, you got to do it exactly the way. Like, imagine if Prince was like, I'm not allowing that to come out. That would be idiotic. That would be complete stupidity for him, for her, and for the entire culture. Like, to me, that's where, like, if a composer says it has to be exactly the way I imagined it, like, that's absurd.
Yeah, so I'm going to throw another bomb in here, because I really think that we're then taught music wrong, because what you just where to start, like in the way that we listen, in piano competitions and in juries, to accuracy of notes, accuracy of interpretation, and being authentic and true to the original autograph version of the score. And we go completely nuts with people who don't follow the score, and this hierarchy of the composer on the pedestal. We should all bow to the great Beethoven, and clearly that's not what you're saying. Clearly you're saying something very different than that.
I think yes. Yeah, yes and no. I think what happened.
You still want to be on the pedestal? No.
No. So I remember. I don't remember who it was, Alon or enough. Someone who studied with Leon Fleischer told me that Leon Fleischer was very big on, like, just play what's there first. Like, just they would have, like, always studio class. It was always everyone in the room, so they got to see someone would come in, play a Haydn sonata, added like a million things, and he was like, well, how about you just play the sonata the way it's written first? And I think and often that would lead to a much better interpretation of the piece for the student. So I think that the error is that I think people collapse the pedagogical need to teach musicians how to read well. So, like, reading music is a tricky thing. So when we grow up, we have to learn how to read well. We have to learn how to understand what's really written there. And there's some things that are much trickier than they even seem, even when you're quite technically proficient. Like, you can be a pretty good technical player and see something in 9/8 and not really know how to count it. Because the way that we are taught music very much focuses on the mechanics and not enough on the musicianship in the earlier stages. Like, if you go back to, like, the 17th century, 18th century, they learned a lot of, like, solfege and keyboard harmony, figured bass. They were really, a lot of the old notation, if you think about how meter worked there, it was much more mathematical. And so musicians had to develop an understanding of metric structure, phrase structure, harmonic structure earlier. And so they were able to read and write more easily as compared to their technical level. But I think one of the problems nowadays is that you get students that are coming to like Juilliard or Peabody or whatever, like very like the top schools, who are extremely proficient technically and not extremely proficient musically in terms of reading, writing. Maybe they're very musical, but maybe they can't read meters very well. Maybe they don't understand the hierarchy of the meter of a 9/8, not to mention, you know, Stravinsky, where it's like really, really, or my music, where it's like much more complex. And so I think pedagogically, and I see this when I teach, sometimes you have to enforce a sort of a strict regime of like, just play what's there, try to get exactly what's there, and then we can talk about interpretation. And I think that later, some people kind of carry that with them and continue to always want only that, which obviously for the listening public, people who are not musicians, that is almost irrelevant. Like for the person going, just like someone listening to Sinead O'Connor, like you said, you didn't know it was a Prince song. You don't care that it's a Prince song. It doesn't matter, right? It's the same thing. Like, you know, like if you think about it, like, you know, you listen, I heard Beethoven Romance in F major yesterday on the radio, just the beginning. I don't know who played it. I never will. It was good. I don't care. I don't care. Like I know the score really well, but it doesn't matter. Like you put it on, you listen to it, you're like, oh, this is really nice. Like for a listener, ultimately, does it work or not? Like for a listener, it doesn't matter how close it is to what Beethoven wrote, because we don't actually know what he meant, and nobody can claim that they do. Nobody can claim.
But they do. But yeah,
well,
that's a different video. Yeah.
That's absurd. But that's absurd. Again, it's absurd. It's absurd. You know, like if you ask me today about the double concerto, I will give you different answers than I did a year ago.
Wow.
I would. It's been a year. I don't remember it as much. I've written 7 million other notes since then. Like it's not so simple what the composer meant.
So let's.
I think it's a collapse of a pedagogical approach that is necessary with what is really a good performance, ultimately.
But I'm going to bring us back to this idea of the hierarchy between the composer and the performer, because clearly we're saying that there's an equality between the two, that both forces come together to create something new. It's like, you know, it's like having a baby. There are two people involved in this experience, and they're both equal in the creation. You can't do it without the other, right?
Right. I'm not sure they're equal in the creation.
Okay, but just in terms of this need to decide that one party is more important than the other, or that there's a, you know, obviously without the notes that you wrote, we can't play the piece, but obviously without us playing the piece, it's a piece of paper. I guess my point is that I feel like we have gotten so far away from what you're just describing, where, you know, we take the score, we internalize it, and we interpret it, to all the way to there's a right way of doing things, and if they're not right, it's the performer's responsibility.
Oh, I just, you know, I don't live in the world of performance very often. Like I conduct here and there, but it's not, I don't perform on a regular basis, and I don't teach performance. And so what you're telling me now is not part of my day-to-day experience.
But I'm sure you see it with performers coming to you, you know, like you walk into the room and the composer is here, oy vey, and the need to, am I doing this right? Am I executing it correctly? Is that what you meant, or not really?
That's not my experience. I feel like almost all the soloists that I've written for have always given me feedback. I'm very grateful for most of the feedback that I've gotten. I would say it's been a very long time since I had a performer that I was not thrilled for their feedback. Really, like it's. I think as I've worked with, you know, really phenomenal soloists and orchestras, conductors, all I'm getting is wonderful contributions. Like I don't actually feel like, and some of them, you know, some of them might seem a very simple technical thing, but can make a big difference for a piece. For example, a recent orchestra piece of mine was done in Germany last month, and the conductor pointed out there were these like swells, like a bar-long swells, and it's like the strings are doing the swells, and there's hits in the percussion and the brass on the downbeat and at the end of the swell, and some pedals and stuff. And I wrote fortepiano at the beginning of the strings. So every bar starts with a fortepiano. It was like he took them out during the rehearsals because they were slowing the orchestra down. And he feels that piece really needs to be metronomic, and I completely agree with him. I think that piece really lives, like it really thrives by the energy of the pulse. And that seems like a small thing, but I think it's a huge thing. Like for me to know that if I put fortepiano, they prepare a little bit longer, and that slows down the piece. The fact that he pinpointed that for me is an incredible contribution. Like it maybe doesn't seem like a big thing, but it might actually mean that this piece has a life or not. If it can like be successful because of some of the things that he suggested. And so I feel like the things that, and this is from a conductor, obviously from a pianist, from a violinist, from any instrument that I don't play, I get even more input of like what works, what makes something virtuosic, what makes it work. Like, when I wrote the double concerto for Pink Zuckerman and Amanda Forsyth, he gave me so much feedback that was way beyond the technical elements of the violin. It's like he's used to playing with very large orchestras on very large stages. And he's like, if you don't do this or that, it's not going to feel concerto enough. Like I added more cadenza. Like there were things that he said. He said, look at this piece, look at this piece, look at like we cut this part of Tchaikovsky because of this. Like the input that he had from 50 years, 60 years of playing on the top stages was so useful, was so like enriching for my understanding of the medium, of the instrument, of so many different things that I don't feel like I think that your metaphor of the pregnancy is actually a great metaphor, because I think it's not about who is more important. I think it's about sort of appreciating what the other person is doing. Right. And I kind of feel like our society for many, many years did not appreciate the person who does more for the baby to be born, the person whose body changes, the person who goes to child. And I think that's a similar thing with performers, what you're describing. Like the person who actually has to work harder ultimately is the performer. Ultimately, it's the performer.
Notice I'm being quiet. I'm just enjoying.
I think it's the performer. I grew up with the same idea of like, oh, the composer, that's the harder work. Well, you have to know how to compose music, yes. But once you do, it's actually harder to sustain like being a good performer, learning a piece and playing it over and over and over and over. Like for you to play my double concerto again would mean that you have to go back and basically learn it again, because it's been almost a year. Like it would be a lot of work, and you'd have to reinterpret parts in it. You'll have to you'd have to do a lot of things. I wouldn't have to do anything.
So I guess the question is, do you feel like you compose the piece and of course you can always tweak it and make changes, but sort of your part is done, and now, the performer comes in and takes whichever, part of it he or she wants. And
yeah. Yes. And it stops like.
Has anybody ever done something that you were like, stop, no?
Look, I've heard not so good performances of my music. Obviously, I've heard like weaker performances, especially student performances. I can't think of like sometimes people either don't understand the piece, more often cannot play technically what I wrote. But I find that performers are really, in general, very committed to the music that they choose to play. And so even people who struggle with certain aspects of the piece always try to bring themselves to the table and to do their best with the piece. Like, yeah, like sometimes you have a performer like in a competition, for example, like, when I wrote pieces for competition, didn't learn the piece completely yet, kind of fumbled it. But again, I think,
Yeah, but that's more, you just didn't do the job. It's not about the
yeah, that's
interpretation.
not.
I'm asking if we played, something for Beethoven or for Brahms and we took the wrong tempo, or word that is often used as, overindulgent playing, would they be like, please stop doing that? Or would it be like, that's interesting.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. They might, but I've heard bad performances of my music. It's not like I've never heard a bad performance of my music, but this is why I said that in the premiere of a piece, and especially if it's being recorded, then I'm more like, I'd really like for it to be the way that I intended as much as possible. Because I think the piece deserves to exist recorded in a way that serves it well. That doesn't mean exactly my tempo. That doesn't mean exactly my dynamic. It doesn't mean all these things. It just means a really good performance of the piece. So early on in the life of the piece, I am more like, I guess I make the effort to help create the conditions that it gets played really, really well as possible. So that, in 2 years, if someone plays it and it's not great, it's too slow, they don't get it, they like phrase it incorrectly, whatever. Someone hears it, they're like, whatever. But then there's still a recording that's good. So you can still go back to that as a reference. I think a bad first recording can be detrimental to the life of a piece. And so once a piece gets played, the more it gets played, like my piece, the Udakrpa Kubrad, the 2 percussion piece, there's like hundreds of YouTube videos of it. It doesn't matter anymore. And
So let's take that for example. And
that's great.
You take a piece that you wrote, and let's just, to make it simple, you have performance A with, with this person, and performance B with that person. And let's make it even more complicated. You have AI playing performance C. As a composer, you're looking at, let's make it like 3 completely different interpretations. Probably the AI is going to give you the most accurate performance of what you wanted. Maybe, we don't know. And performance A and B are, day and night. Do you as a composer go, all my children welcome, or do you go, I do have a preference? Like, how do you feel about that?
It's really specific. Yeah. It really, really depends. It really, really depends. So like, like I'll give you a closer, like this, my second sonata, which you've played many times, and which other pianists have played many times, and which you play very differently from some other pianists. And I love your interpretation, and I love some of the other interpretations as well. And I appreciate that if I asked you about those interpretations, you might have a bigger problem with it than I do. Because your element in the performance is what they do differently.
Right.
That's not my part in the creation of this experience. My part is different, so I can appreciate, but again, it's only if the performance is technically good and some of the basic elements, the grammar of the music, the balance. Like if you voiced all the chords in a weird way, I'd probably not like it. Like in a weird way that doesn't work. If you found voicing that works great, that's a different thing. But like ultimately, it's about the music working. It's about the flow of the music. It's about the expression. It's about the, you know how it is. Like if
I know, but
you change the octave of a note and I like it better, I'll put that note.
I know that's maybe the thing that I love, and I learned so much from, especially when we did the album, just the flexibility that you would have when I would say, does it really have to be this difficult? Or, can we take this note out? Can we change it? And you were like, sure. And I'm thinking like, wow, if we could only have this conversation with Beethoven a couple of places. Like, does he mind that we do that in the Hammer Clavier? Does he have a problem with the hand divisions? Maybe he doesn't have a problem with just people have been, going on stage and starting with a mistake, for not, because we're too scared of changing the, so I think that this issue of staying true to the composer's intention. And we're lucky that we have with you, there's a living composer you can talk to, but when we don't, this idea of what's, authentic and what's true, and of course perfection added to the mix, it creates a lot of problems. And I think we lost the flexibility that you're clearly telling us we have. I think when it comes to music that is in the canon, we don't really feel that comfortable taking those liberties.
And I think, yeah, and I think ultimately, if you sort of put aside the emotional side of it and just look at the evidence is that Beethoven probably wouldn't mind so much, and definitely Bach wouldn't mind so much. Why do I say this? Why do I feel confident to say this? Because Bach would take a piece that he wrote and arrange it 20 different times. So one day it's a partita for violin solo, and the next day it's a cantata with solo organ and orchestra, right? Like, why would he do this? But then if you didn't play it exactly the way that he wants, like, that seems absurd. To me, that seems absurd. That seems insane. Like, to say, okay, Bach was fine taking a Vivaldi concerto for 4 violins and writing them for 4 keyboards, signing his name as the composer. But if you did more ritardando than he intended, he would be very upset.
Yeah.
Like maybe he wouldn't like.
Actually, I wrote.
Maybe he would like ritardando, but maybe he would. Like, who knows?
I mean, this is completely a crazy question to even ask, but 200 years from now, you're sitting in heaven listening to somebody playing your piece, and you go like, "Oh no, what are they doing?" Would there be something that you could imagine that somebody would do to your music, like, I don't know, playing it on electronic keyboards or synthesizer? Like, no, that's not what I meant. Can we please go back to my original intention? Or
I'll give you a good example. So that piece, the Udo Krepa, there's a version that a quartet in Europe, the Wave Quartet, made for 4 percussion. And they added quite a bit of like percussion, almost like drum parts, almost like accompanying the music, which really changes the way the piece feels and works, like on a very like serious level. And I remember they first sent it to me after they recorded it. So like they made the arrangement, they recorded it for like Sony Classic, big label, and they sent it to me. And I listened to it the first time and I was like, this is not the piece that I wrote. It's exactly what you said. And so I wrote them back and I was like, can we work on this together a little bit? And they were like, this is the master and it's already like with a label. Like, we can't make any changes. And so, I had a dilemma. I was like, what do I do with this? And my response was like, okay, this is different than what I meant. It's actually different than what I meant. This is not the piece that I wrote. It works in a certain way. Again, not the way that I intended. It's done very well. And I'm like, great. Okay, great. Like, and that's fine. And if someone did it and it didn't work, I think that's fine too. Like, I think that's fine, because ultimately the reason that we are so focused on the composer, ultimately the reason that we think about it that way has to do with copyright, which is like an economic, it's a money business decision. Like, the reason Bach signed his name was that back then it didn't matter. There was no copyright. There was no, like, it was not perceived. Like, if you actually, again, if you go to popular music, listen to certain bands perform their music over time, it changes all the time. Or like in jazz, this recording and that recording, Miles Davis recorded the same tune 6 times and every time it's different, right? Like, it's not the same. And he wrote the tune. But what did he do? He wrote the notes, he wrote the chords, and that's it. And like, different people.
Then they released the tracks that they didn't release on the original CD.
Exactly. So and different lyrics and whatnot. Like, you get all these like varieties, and that's when the music is much more alive as a musical culture. As sort of more classical performers, we are focused so much on music by dead people And so much has to do with copyright because this music is written down. So the moment it's created legally, there's an entity and you can't just use it, you can't change it. Like there's elements that have to do, and I'm very grateful that we have these laws. So like, you know, I can have a reasonable living. Like it's helpful for composers, but I think again, like to take that and to collapse it into what is allowed or what is reasonable to do with a piece of music. Like again, you can play the Brahms concertos in a way that's unusual, and some people might not like it. I think that's perfectly fine. Just like some people go and listen to Prince sing Nothing Compares to You, and they're like, I don't like it.
Right.
Well, like it better. Why does that matter so much? It's better that there's two recordings. It's better.
Well, I just going to as a side note that what's happening, for example, now with Facebook, when you are posting your own interpretation of a piece, their bot takes it down because some big record company decided that it's theirs and it's copyrighted. And you know, no matter how many times you write to Facebook, hey, no, it's Bach, it's my interpretation, doesn't really matter. So there's another, you know, another front now for interpreters trying to interpret music from the common domain and not getting their individual performance accepted as part of that panorama.
But I think obviously I've had that happen. Like I conducted the Brahms violin concerto, and I don't remember who they thought it was, their bots. But I think that also like connects with your point about everyone playing, like everyone ending up playing it
very similarly.
Yes. So like
you heard it here first. Play everything in a different tempi, and then the bot will not know it's.
So maybe the bots will actually free us from some of this tyranny of everything has to be the same. Because I think it's wrong. We know for a fact, we know that Chopin did not play his pieces the same way every single time.
In fact, he would make his students improvise different interpretations.
Yeah, he didn't play the same notes. Like, what are we talking about here? You're not like playing different notes. You're like taking a rubato somewhere. And people are, well, that's not what Brahms wrote. Like, who knows? On another day, he would have put a ritardando there. Like, who knows what he would have done? And we know for a fact that all of these people, you go from history, Josquin and Bach and Beethoven, Mozart, Brahms, Chopin, all the Poulenc, all of them were great improvisers. Every single one. Right. Paganini, like, hard to find one composer that we don't have any evidence that they were like improvisers. Because, you know, how do you end up composing music? Like, you must be the kind of person who sits down and just like
try things,
messes around with notes and chords. So this idea that somehow not playing it, whatever, metronomically or the dynamics, that is not true to the original intent. I think it's the opposite. I think Chopin's original intent was that it wouldn't be played the same every single time. I think that was his intent. You said he would make his students improvise. So the intention was not to play the music the way he wrote it. So we're not there. We're so far from that. So taking 3% back towards that, I think is a positive.
The pendulum will just swing a little bit back to the center.
Right. And as a composer, again, I feel that's a strength of a piece of music, that people can interpret it differently. And sometimes it's better, and sometimes it's worse, and sometimes it's just different. But the piece lives on. My biggest successes are pieces that get different interpretations. Like I wish all my pieces would be played enough.
So let's bring it back to the performer. Like, what would be your, I don't know, like top 5 for what should the performer do when they get a score of yours, or the masterpiece? Like, what do you want us as performers?
Well, if it's a new piece, I would say be in touch with the composer early on. Show them how the instrument works. Show them how you interact with the instrument. Like, I know how piano works, that's my instrument, and yet I know how you interact with the piano too. And so when I write for you, I write differently than when I write for someone else. So early on, I think kind of giving the composer some of your aura as a performer, like, gives a lot to the process. And then I think as you get materials, whether it's finished or not finished, again, if you study it deeply, if you really study it and really try to understand what the composer tried to communicate, and then offer whatever you can to help the music get there. So like, if I wrote something and it works great and you understand it, awesome, just play it. But if I wrote something and you think you understand what I meant, and it's a little bit awkward because I wrote a B flat and then a big chord, you're like, how about the B flat is with the left hand? Right? If only someone said that to Beethoven, he would have written F, right? That's all that would
He
take.
should know he was a pianist. I mean, but I guess, you know, there was no microphone there to catch him miss the chord.
First of all, he may have played it like that.
Right.
Or maybe he wanted it to be really difficult. But if he wanted it to be difficult, he should have written left hand on purpose.
By the way, for those who are listening and have no idea what we're talking about, Hammer Clavier first movement, the leap in the left hand. Go check it out.
But you know what I mean? Like I remember reading this letter that Prokofiev wrote to someone that he was learning one of his sonatas for the world premiere. I think it was one of the later sonatas. I don't remember exactly. And he was like complaining how difficult it was. And I remember I was very young when I read it. I was like, what? Like, you don't know how to play it already? But that's part of it. Like, as you become more proficient as a composer, when you're very young, you basically play and write. As you become a better composer, you're really just writing. It doesn't matter if you can play the instrument or not. And so, yes, like, we miss things all the time. And that's part of the beauty. Like, you can look in the Brahms violin concerto versus the double concerto, where in the violin concerto, Joachim changed a million notes, and in the double concerto, he didn't. And ask any violinist, which part is better? And they'll tell you which part works, which part is more idiomatic for the instrument. It's by far the violin concerto, by far. And there's places where you can just see that Brahms didn't write them. Like, you can tell that he didn't write the notes, but the music is there. So I would say, if you get a piece from me, like you did with the double concerto, for example, you learned it really deeply. And then we had a Zoom.
Well, I know what I would consider
That's perfect.
deeply, but maybe you can elaborate. What do you mean by learning the score deeply? What is that? Like, let's mark the phrases, let's think about the emotional, like what is that?
Whatever your process is to try to understand the piece. So I know in your case, there's like the emotion side and the phrasing. Some people, it's very technical for them and they just absorb the music and they don't need too much like an intellectual element. Whatever it is, like what I would say is, don't like look at it one time and call the composer up and say, oh, this is too hard. This is impossible to play. Like, that's when you're like, okay, what should I do? Oh, well, slow it down. Like, that's not helpful. That's not helpful. But if you like learn, if you try to learn it and you say, look, I don't think this is working. I think I get what you're trying to do, but what you wrote doesn't work for this instrument or for me on this instrument, even on that level. And just be like, this works. Like in the mandolin concerto, for example, the first presto at the very beginning, there's like an adagio and then a first presto. And originally, I don't remember, the chords were like the arpeggios were small, and Avi was like, we need to change the position of the arpeggios because it doesn't work on the mandolin. So we sat together and we fixed it. And it works great now. Or I recently wrote a piece for the other way around. I really wrote a piece for viola da gamba and bass clarinet. Hasn't been premiered. And the gamba player, she emailed me with some comments. And one of the main ones was that in certain places, the chords were very like open chords, arpeggios, but, sixths and fifths. And she said, the gamba is tuned like a guitar. So we just can't do that fast. It's like, if you want me to get to your tempo, this doesn't work.
Yeah.
He's like, I tried, I can tell that I can learn it, but I'll never get to your tempo. It won't be the effect you want. So I squish the chords, and now they work. So like, those are things that might seem to a performer either outside of what you're allowed to say or not so important. But really, if you understand the piece and you understand that if you slow down there, like she got to a point where she understood that if she slows down there, that's going to miss my intention in her mind. And she wanted to understand why it doesn't work. So I came up with a solution. It took me 10 minutes to change that place. It took me nothing. Like, once I understand the instrument, it's nothing. It's so easy. Right. It's so easy. And to me, that's been my experience. And I think that's the best way to interact with the composer. Now, some composers, from what I hear, will not discuss these things at all, but I think they're missing something I think they're missing quite a few things, actually. Like, they're missing understanding these instruments better. They're missing learning how to express themselves better. Like, for example, you told me that I don't write enough expressive words, and I keep hearing that, and I keep getting better. No, it's like my blind spot. So we all have blind spots.
Because
right?
I mean, for me, it's such an important point when I see the potentiality of what you're writing, and it can go in this way or in that way or in a third way, and I want you to tell me, you wrote the piece, what did you hear? Then I can make a decision where I maybe not follow your instruction, but I think I want more specificity.
Right. And sometimes it's even just like there's a new section starting and the tempo stays the same, but the music has a very different expression. And if I don't write something there, it'll take a while for the ensemble or the performer to get to the understanding that, even with rehearsal letters. Nowadays, rehearsal letters for me are really a way to communicate more information to the player. Like, there's a rehearsal letter here, so we always start rehearsing from there. So that becomes the beginning of a new section. So there's a lot of little things. And how do I know that? I learned it from performers. So I think composers were not open to that. I think they think that they're like protecting their authentic voice, but I think they're actually missing learning where they have blind spots. And I think they're missing the opportunity to create true partnerships with performers. And I think that's, like, again, if we go back to like a little bit of the practicality of the world, like, if a performer likes your music but hates you personally, or feels like you wouldn't budge on anything, I think that doesn't necessarily, like, if I change 3 notes in a piece for a performer and they feel like their voice was heard, now they own the piece more. I'm not saying I'm doing it for that. I'm saying if I'm not open, them making suggestions, why should I expect them to put their whole heart into the piece? And again, going back to your metaphor of it's a partnership. And again, I'm not an active performer, and so I need you. I need people to play viola da gamba. Like, I don't know how to play viola da gamba. I don't.
So I will finish the last question. Like, if you could come up with a tip of advice to young artists, young performers, what would be your tip? What do you think we need nowadays in 2023?
I think, and I think I might have mentioned that to your students when I was in Fredonia. I think there's a great opportunity for performers to partner with composers of their generation or similar generation. I think there's always an opportunity there. And I think, often I see, like, my composition students, a fellow performer likes their music. And so I always tell them, okay, do something with them. Ask them to write a piece for you, record that piece, perform that piece. And the potential for growth together, both musically, personally, and career-wise, I think is immense. And I think it's always true. And I remember a very famous composer saying this to us at Tanglewood, and I was I was sarcastic about it.
You know, you were hostile? No.
I was I kind of I kind of didn't believe him, but he was right. So I think that still would be like for example, I had a student who wrote a piece for euphonium and piano for a euphonium player at Ginsberg. And she just graduated. She's going for her master's. And his teacher sent the recording of the piece to the main publisher of euphonium music. And they contacted her and they just published it. So she just finished her undergrad and she has a piece published by the one publisher of music for lowbrass. I don't remember their name, but I looked it up. That's where people look for music. So, and the recording is by this student. So everyone benefited in a way that is just because he asked her to write a piece and then worked with her, because she didn't know how to write for euphonium. Her teacher was not the most biggest expert on euphonium either. So it was really up to the other student to kind of come back with suggestions. And the piece turned out to be really beautiful, and a major publisher took it. And so everyone, and it says who it was commissioned by. So this student, just by having the initiative and the insight of like, oh, I want a piece from a friend. I want to invest my time in someone who I think is talented and has something to say. I see it again and again and again happening in my career. Like our history is the same, right? Like for both of us. And there's no it's truly like there's no losers in this situation. Like the worst case scenario is that I wrote a bad piece and you didn't like it, and that's it. So try again, right? That would have been the worst case scenario.
Well, the worst case scenario, you give me the score 3 days about that.
Yeah, but the reality is that you know, we have commercial CDs together. We have, you know, a history of you performing my music, me writing for you. Like your name is on my pieces. When they got published, people knew it. Like it helped everyone. Like nobody suffered. Nobody had a loss.
Right.
And it was just because you had, again, the initiative to say, okay, I'll play more Prokofiev and Bartok and Mozart and whatnot and Brahms.
No, Mozart was not in the loop, but yeah.
But I also want something from you, because I like the music that you write. I think you're talented. I think you can write a good violin sonata, right? Like, you know, like you were the one who said that. You were the one. I wouldn't have written that sonata, and it's now been recorded and very well reviewed, and like it's great. And we're talking 20 years now. Like, and that exists in the world. It exists in the world. So we created something together. So I think, again, if I go back to the popular music example, like I like popular music, not just because I like popular music, but because it's a very living medium still. Especially some parts of it are still like really alive. Like creation is at the heart of what people do. And I think, again, like when you have a band that performs together and one person writes the song, someone else performs them with them, then you know, it's very mutually beneficial. So that would be my recommendation to young performers.
I guess maybe to close the whole thing, I think when we were asked to play a concerto here at Fredonia, and I was thinking, okay, you know, Tchaikovsky, Rachmaninoff, Grieg, what do I want to play? And I'm like, I love that music. It's fantastic. But so many people have said such profound artistic truth with these pieces that I don't really feel like I have something revolutionary to offer the world with those works. And I would much rather bring something new into the world that cello and, piano concerto, that's rare. And then you're going to write the music, and it's going to be the first time that we put, I think that's to me so much more exciting and filled with potential than repeating or trying to come. I think maybe that's my point. Trying to come up with something original to say with something that has already been in circulation for hundreds of years.
Yeah, Yeah, and if that piece becomes a piece that gets performed a lot, then your recording is going to be the reference. Your performances are the reference
From
points.
your
They are
lips to God's ears. Yeah.
already, like, when people ask about this piece, already that's the reference. If
Right.
you go to my website, there's a video of you playing it, and that's it. That's the reference. And so the same way that other pieces of mine that have become pieces that get performed a lot, there is the reference, which is and that's what I'm saying. Like the original recording is almost like
Yeah.
it's almost like a second score.
Right.
In a way, it's more than a score. So, in 50 years, if someone wants to like understand something about that piece, they will go back to these recordings and be like, well, the composer
You're
was
like,
there.
was that his idea? Was that the crazy pianist messing with yeah.
Right. Right. Right.
Like you look at the kid and go like, is that from mom or is that from dad? Like, why is that there? Okay, on that happy note, I think we should do this again to talk about something else because it was so much fun and I'm so glad that the camera was rolling. Avner Dorman, thank you very much. And
Thank you. Happy to do it again.
bye, everybody.